So let's carry on. We ended the last video on this notion of promise keeping and how, and this again, we're this search for what, what makes right acts right. Well, remember your friend yesterday had promised to come for coffee today. And then the first example, the first development of this little example was your friend just says, I'm not going to show up. I'm not coming. And then offers nothing else. And you would say, hey, you promised, as in the promising is part of what you did, and that's the obligation, right? So it's right for you to come. You have an obligation. Now, and if the friend just says, well, if I, no, I'm not coming, you'd say, well, do you understand what it means to promise? But let's develop it a little further and follow Ross. He says something like, well, wait a second. The reason why I'm not going to show up is there is actually a little bit of a story here. Is that, I have a sick mom, right? And I have to take her to the hospital for some treatment or something like that. Now, we'd probably say, okay, well, then you're justified in breaking this promise, right? And it would go something like this. Ross says, well, like, what would a utilitarian say? Well, the reason why you're justified in breaking this promise to come for coffee is because the amount of good that you would look at the two situations and say, which one produces more good? Which one is right? Again, the ideal utilitarian, that action which is right is the one that produces the most good of all the actions available. So if we simplify and say, well, the subject, your friend, has two actions available, come for coffee with you or take mom to the hospital. Which one produces the most good? Well, I'm going to take mom to the hospital. Now, Ross says, yeah, you can read it that way, certainly, and you get the answer that Ross thinks is the right answer, as in you can justifiably break this promise, right? Ross thinks, yes, you can. But he says that, and you could read the situation, you could interpret the situation as the utilitarian one does, interpreting our moral reason, your friend's moral reasoning along the weighing of goods, like which one will produce more goods. But do we even think like that? Like, imagine if you were faced with the choice of taking your mom or a loved one. It doesn't really matter, but somebody very important to you, and going for coffee. And you find, oh, I got to take my mom tomorrow. I already promised. Would you sit there and go, well, which one? Ross says, you wouldn't sit there and go, which one produces the most good, and I will act on that. No, he says that what you have is that we have basically duties, right? You would say, well, the duty to my friend, your friend says, well, the duty to you is to honor my promise to you, but I also have a duty to my mother, and maybe I have a duty to alleviate suffering in the world, right, by taking people in. Maybe it's not my mom, maybe it's somebody who's really sick, and it doesn't have to be necessarily be a mom. It could just be someone, my neighbor. I maybe don't even know them that well, but we would certainly be, I think most people would be okay if someone said, I have to break my promise to go have coffee with you because the neighbor that I don't really know him that well, but he's really sick and he needs me to drive him to the hospital. So I'm going to do that. So I have an obligation, not necessarily in terms of productive of good. We don't think of that. We would just like, yeah, if I can help lessen the amount of pain in the world, I'm going to do that, right? So I have a duty to alleviate pain, something like that. But the point is that we do think, according to Ross, how we actually think is in terms of duties. Now, Ross says that other theories might be simpler in weighing of goods, but that's not actually how we think. And so our moral theories, here's a bit of a descriptive aspect of, they're not purely normative, right? They are descriptive in the sense of how do we actually think. And Ross thinks that we actually reason in terms of duty. So Kant is right. In that sense, the deontological line is we think in turn, we're duty thinking creatures. We're not utilitarian, bean counting, weighing of production of goods, and no, and then counting these things up. We don't perform a utilitarian type calculus at all. That's a little bit of a caricature, but of the utilitarian thinkers. Mill wouldn't like it, but roughly, Ross is saying we do think more really in terms of duties. But again, you can interpret it in terms of a kind of utilitarian calculus if you want. But Ross has one little bit more of a kicker here to sort of drive home the point that we really are non-utilitarian. We really are duty-thinking creatures, as Kant said we are, although Kant is a little too strict and a little too simple. Life's a little messier than what Kant liked to think it was. But Ross says that Kant is right. We are duty type creatures. But here's Ross's extension. It goes something like this. Let's say we were in a situation, if we have, how does it go? Something like this. Your friend says to you, I'm not coming for coffee. And then you say, why? And he says something like this. Well, I was on my way to come have coffee with you, and I ran into Sally. So there you are. I know you're at the coffee shop. I'm on my way over, and I'm like, hey, there's Sally. And Sally says to me, have coffee. And so I knew at that time that you really wanted to see me, and we'd have a good time, and so there would be, happiness there. And I knew Sally wanted to hang out with me, and I knew there'd be happiness there. And you know what? It turns out that, quote unquote, objectively speaking, the units of happiness that would be generated by me having coffee with you is equal to the units of happiness that would be generated total, right, of having coffee with Sally. So you know what? I looked at the two and I said, hey, they're both equal. So, and you would be equally disappointed, right? Both of you would be, so everything's equal, right? So just for the sake of the discussion, your friend is, let's say he's even correct. Like for the sake of discussion, let's say he's correct that your sadness over not getting coffee would be equally matched by her sadness of not getting coffee, and your joy would be equally matched by her. So everything is absolutely equal. And so your friend says, well, I'm a utilitarian, so I couldn't figure out what to do. Kind of like the old thing of the old Buridan's donkey, right? Being caught between two equally delicious piles of hay, and was in a bad state because it couldn't decide which one to go to, and then kind of starved. But in any case, are we ever caught in that kind of a situation? But wouldn't that strike you as odd? And then your friend says, so when I have these two equal collections of goodness being generated or happiness being generated, I flipped a coin. Right? That's it. I just flipped a coin. Why? Because the utilitarian calculus wouldn't tell me what to do. Right? I ran into a brick wall. I ran into two possibilities. They're mutually exclusive. I can't do both. Right? And let's say, just for the sake of discussion, I had to do one. Right? Okay. Utilitarianism won't tell me which one to do. Right? It says just either is fine. What would you say about that? That's when you'd probably yell once again, you promised, right? You promised you'd come see me for coffee. So then again, you would say to your friend, you really don't understand how promises work. So if you were in this situation of your friend where you had promised and then you see another friend, you think all things considered, you would, chances are, as Ross would say, that you would think in terms of duties. Right, so you would think of, well, I did make a promise. I have a duty to keep that, even though the generation of goods would be the same no matter which option. So I'm not thinking in terms of goods generation or happiness generation. I'm thinking in terms of duties, and that's the theory that fits how we actually are. And so Ross then looks at having this case of conscience of when we get into these situations, and how do we get ourselves out of them. He looks at Kant a little bit, and he looks at Moore and Rashtal, who was a well-known philosopher at the time, and he thinks that Kant and his absolute deontological framework which groups duties into perfect duties like promise keeping, and perfect duties admit no exception, versus imperfect duties which admit of exceptions. Alleviate pain. There might be times where you don't, but there's no the perfect duty is like telling the truth. You don't ever get a break with con. Like, you tell the truth all the time, and you keep your promises all the time. Those are perfect duties. You can't fiddle with them. You always must discharge them. And then, of course, more is the looking at the generation of the most good. And Ross thinks these are just too simplistic. They're nice theories. You can try and argue, but that's not how we think. That's not how the world works, and they don't fit the facts of our moral lives. And there's Ross insisting that a theory, has to fit the facts of our moral lives. And the problem is that. Kant is too simplistic with his division of perfect and imperfect duties, and Moore's theory reduces all our relations, this whole complex set of relations we have with people, like your mom, your dad, wives, your dog, everything, down to possible beneficiaries of your actions, so that that's all you think about, right? It's whatever you're dealing with people, all you think about is which action produces the most good. So all relationships are simply ones that are you turn everybody into a possible beneficiary of your good, of your generated good, and he thinks that this doesn't cover the complexity of our lives. These different relations are just that. They're different. They all serve, though, these relationships as the foundation of duties that you have, and he calls these prima facie duties. So you have prima facie duties, and that are generated by all the relationships you have, and these duties are different and they can clash. And this is sometimes regarded as one of the big breakthroughs in 20th century deontology, is to get rid of Kant's notion of the perfect and imperfect duties to a looser but more accurate notion of duty in terms of a prima facie duty. And so Ross says something like this: these prima facie duties, they have stronger and weaker claims on you depending on the circumstance. Now, if that makes you think, hey, according to circumstance, doesn't that sound a little bit like virtue in Aristotle? Yeah, not a surprise there. So remember, Ross was a well-known scholar of Aristotle. So here's a little bit of Aristotle, the contextualization of duty. Kant did not like that idea, right? Because he had no notion of a perfect duty, which actually doesn't have a context, because you just always do it no matter what. Maybe a little bit of contextualization with the notion of an imperfect duty, but certainly not with perfect duty. So Kant, that structure that Kant set up within the concept of duty, Ross wants to loosen that and import, shall we say, a little touch of Aristotle, contextualization. So when I'm in a situation, and we are always in these, such that I could be faced with several prima facie duties. You're a friend of mine, I have a mom, I have a dad, I have a dog, and I could have conflicts and things that are pulling me in different directions. I could have several conflicting duties. And as a matter of fact, that's life. Life is just, you're always in this nexus of relations and possible conflicts of duties. And they are, and you can be in situations where you have several of them pulling at you. So what do? You carefully study the situation that you're in, the best that you can, until you form a considered opinion. You don't have absolute certainty. That's the best you got, is considered opinion, that one of these prima facie duties prevails over the others. And the forming of this considered opinion, which leads to this one primary prima facie duty, that will become your duty, kind of like Kant said, that will become your perfect duty in that context, or the duty sans phrase, in other words, without qualification. So it is the examination of a situation, a probable or a considered opinion, and that leads to a feeling and thinking that you're bound by one of these prima facie duties. So if you change that situation, you could have that same ensemble of prima facie duties, but if the situation's changed and you do an examination, you could very well come to a different considered opinion, and a different prima facie duty would become the duty, primary obligations sans phrase, without qualification. So it is contextualizing the notion of duty, or as I like to say, it's sort of a little bit of a Kantianism, kind of a little bit watered down, a little twist of Aristotle. And Ross thinks we've got a more realistic notion of duty happening here. We'll look a little bit more at this notion of prima facie duty in the next video.